Long before satellites revealed every coastline, mapmakers faced a terrifying blank space at the world's edge. They filled these voids not with data, but with dragons. This is the story of the lost cartographers of antiquity, visionaries who drew the boundaries of reality itself. By the end of our journey, you will see every modern map in a new light, understanding the deep human yearning that first gave our world its shape. We will uncover how a single miscalculation by a genius named Ptolemy sent explorers toward a new continent, and why sailors' charts were once considered deadly state secrets. These maps were more than navigation tools. They were declarations of belief, power, and fear. What forgotten courage does it take to draw a line into the absolute unknown? This small clay tablet, no larger than your hand, holds the entire world. Crafted in Babylon over 2,600 years ago, the Imago Mundi presents a radical vision. The Earth is a flat disk floating on a vast, bitter ocean, with Babylon itself placed confidently at the center. Radiating out from this cosmic hub are triangular regions labeled simply, beyond the river, the uncharted lands where the sun goes to rest. This was not a tool for travel, but a declaration of cosmic order. For these earliest cartographers, to draw the world was to explain the very reason for its existence, weaving together the paths of rivers with the whims of gods, the locations of cities with the stories of creation. Their maps were cosmological diagrams meant to be read not by sailors, but by priests and kings. They answered the most profound questions a civilization could ask. Where are we? The answer was at the center of everything. What lies beyond? A divine and often dangerous mystery. This fusion of observable reality and sacred story established the very purpose of a map for centuries to come. We see it in the intricate maps of the Egyptian afterlife, guiding souls through the underworld, and in the Norse conception of a world tree, Yggdrasil, supporting the 9 realms. Accuracy in our modern sense was irrelevant. The truth these maps conveyed was far deeper than topography. It was a spiritual and philosophical truth about humanity's place in the cosmos. This rich tapestry of myth and measurement would eventually demand a new kind of mind, one that sought to separate the threads of observation from the threads of legend, setting the stage for the first great attempt to measure the world itself. Yet this cosmic certainty, with Babylon at its heart, was about to be shattered by a radical idea. In the bustling intellectual capital of Alexandria, a scholar named Eratosthenes looked at the world not as a flat disk ordained by gods, but as a geometric puzzle to be solved. His laboratory was the entire planet, and his tools were a simple stick, the sun, and an unwavering faith in logic. The story is legendary. Eratosthenes learned that on a certain day each year in the southern city of Spherical, the sun shone directly down a deep well, illuminating the bottom. This meant the sun was directly overhead. On that same day in Alexandria, however, a vertical stick cast a distinct shadow. To any other mind, this was a simple curiosity. To Eratosthenes, it was the key to the world's size. He reasoned that if the Earth were flat, no shadow would appear at both locations simultaneously. The only explanation was a curved surface. By measuring the angle of the shadow in Alexandria and knowing the distance between the two cities, he performed a calculation of breathtaking elegance, determining the Earth's circumference with an accuracy that would not be surpassed for over 1,000 years. This was the Greek Revolution, a fundamental shift from mapping as a declaration of belief to mapping as a science of measurement. Philosophers like Pythagoras and Aristotle had already argued for a spherical Earth, observing how ships disappeared hull first over the horizon and how the Earth's shadow during a lunar eclipse was always round. But Eratosthenes did something more profound. He gave that sphere a number, a definitive scale. This new understanding demanded a new way of drawing. If the world was a sphere, how could you flatten it onto a sheet of papyrus? The answer was a grid, a coordinate system of lines of latitude and longitude. Eratosthenes drew this grid across his conception of the known world, from the British Isles to the tip of Sri Lanka. His map, now lost to time, was the first to use these parallel and meridian lines to rationally place lands and seas in relation to one another. It was a monumental leap, asserting that the world could be understood through human reason alone. But this powerful new tool came with a hidden cost. By creating a measurable, logical framework, the mapmaker's imagination was now confined by its own grid. The blank spaces beyond the known world were no longer the domain of gods and monsters, but of calculation and probability. The great unknown became a mathematical challenge, an emptiness that begged not for myth but for measurement. And into that calculated void, one of Eratosthenes' most brilliant successors would make a mistake so significant it would echo through the ages, guiding explorers toward an accidental new world. Yet this scientific revolution contained the seeds of its own stagnation. 4 centuries after Eratosthenes, another Alexandrian scholar named Claudius Ptolemy produced a work so comprehensive it would dominate geography for the next millennium. His Geographia was not merely a map, but an entire system. It provided meticulous instructions for projecting the spherical Earth onto a flat surface using a grid of latitude and longitude, and it listed the precise coordinates for over 8,000 locations, from cities to mountain ranges. Ptolemy's goal was to replace speculation with a standardized mathematical framework, creating the first user manual for the world. His authority was so immense that when his original manuscript was lost to Western Europe after the fall of Rome, its rediscovery in the 14th century was nothing short of an intellectual earthquake. For medieval scholars, it was like finding a technical blueprint from a more advanced civilization. But this masterpiece was fatally flawed. Ptolemy made 2 critical errors that would echo through history. First, he rejected Eratosthenes' more accurate calculation of the Earth's circumference in favor of a smaller estimate by another philosopher, Posidonius. This shrank the entire planet by about 25%. Second, he depicted the Indian Ocean as a landlocked sea, with a vast, unknown southern continent connecting Africa to Asia. These were not wild guesses, they were calculated mistakes based on imperfect data, yet they were presented with the full weight of scientific authority. This is the great paradox of Ptolemy's work. He gave Europe the very tools for precise navigation, the coordinate system that would guide explorers across oceans, while simultaneously convincing them the world was smaller and more enclosed than it truly was. His map became a cage of certainty, a prison of precision that would take incredible courage to break. When a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus studied a version of Ptolemy's map, he saw a tantalizing possibility. The distance to Asia sailing west across this shrunken globe seemed not just feasible but destined. Ptolemy's era, enshrined as fact for over 1,000 years, was about to accidentally guide Europe toward 2 new continents. The authority of the ancient mapmaker had become so absolute that it took a journey into the unknown to finally prove him wrong. But as the light of classical science faded with the Roman Empire, the very purpose of a map was transformed once more. Inside the quiet scriptorium of a medieval monastery, a monk dips his quill not to chart coastlines, but to illustrate the soul's journey. The world he draws is not the measured sphere of Eratosthenes or the precise grid of Ptolemy. It is a spiritual blueprint known as a Mappaemundi, a map of the world and of time itself. These were not tools for travelers, they were sermons in parchment designed to teach a Christian worldview. The most common form was the TO map, a deceptively simple diagram. The O is the circle of the known world, encircled by a great ocean. Inside, a T shape is formed by the waters that divide the three continents. The vertical stem of the T is the Mediterranean Sea, separating Europe from Africa, while the horizontal bar is formed by the Don River and the Nile, separating Asia from the other two. Here, geography submits completely to theology. East is placed at the top of the map, for that is the direction of the rising sun and the location of the Garden of Eden. Jerusalem sits at the exact center of the world, the spiritual navel of creation. Accuracy in distance or shape was irrelevant. The map's truth was its moral order. The edges of these maps are particularly fascinating. Beyond the orderly TO structure, the outer rings become a canvas for the unknown and the divine. Here, in the margins of the world, you might find the monstrous races described by ancient writers like Pliny, the Cyapods who shaded themselves with a single giant foot, or the Blemii, men with their faces on their chests. These were not merely fanciful decorations, they represented the spiritual frontiers of a fallen world, places that existed at the limits of salvation, testing the faith of mankind. The entire map told a story, from the creation in the east to the potential for redemption or damnation at its chaotic edges. It was a portrait of a universe where every mountain and river had a moral significance, and every journey was ultimately a pilgrimage. This vision of the world as a stage for divine drama would profoundly influence the European imagination for centuries, creating a mental landscape where exploration was not just a physical challenge, but a spiritual quest. The drive to reach the earthly paradise in the east would one day compel travelers to seek new routes, not around the world's spiritual edges, but straight through them. Yet within the scriptoriums of Europe, the world was still a flat disk centered on Jerusalem. Far to the south and east, under the vast dome of a different sky, an entirely different cartographic tradition was reaching its zenith. While kingdoms in the west fragmented, the Islamic world forged a sprawling network of trade and scholarship that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the islands of Indonesia. In cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars were not only preserving the forgotten works of Ptolemy and Eratosthenes, they were actively correcting them. They treated Greek geography not as an unchangeable holy text, but as a starting point for a new, more rigorous science. These Arab geographers possessed something the ancients lacked: a flood of new data from merchants and travelers who sailed the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean and caravaned along the Silk Road. They understood that the Indian Ocean was not a landlocked sea as Ptolemy had insisted, but a vast, open body of water connecting East Africa to India and beyond. They charted the contours of Africa with a precision that Europe would not match for centuries, gathering first-hand accounts that spoke of a continent that curved southward, suggesting it could be circumnavigated. The most stunning example of this fusion of knowledge and power is the Tabula Rogeriana, created by the renowned geographer Al-Idrisi. In an extraordinary cultural exchange, this Muslim scholar worked for over 15 years at the court of the Christian Norman king, Roger II of Sicily. Al-Idrisi did not rely on old books alone. He convened a commission of scholars who systematically interviewed travelers, compared their stories, and compiled their findings. The resulting map, engraved on a massive silver disc, was oriented with south at the top, a perspective that reflected the flow of knowledge from the African and Asian heartlands. It presented a world that was more complete, more interconnected, and far more accurate than any European map of the era. The Arab geographers were the vital bridge. They kept the flame of classical science burning, but they also added new fuel, the hard-won empirical data of global exploration. Their maps were not declarations of faith or sermons in parchment. They were functional, sophisticated tools for understanding a complex and interconnected world. This more accurate vision of the Earth's edges, carefully preserved and enhanced, would eventually find its way back to a Europe that was slowly awakening, ready to use this rediscovered knowledge to sail into the very voids that the ancients could only imagine. But that silver disc crafted for a king was a world away from the rolling deck of a ship. In the salt-stained hands of a Genos captain, a different kind of map told a different kind of truth. This was the Portolan chart, a document not of faith or scholarship, but of pure survival. Unrolled on a table weighted against the sea's pitch, its surface was a dense, practical tapestry. The parchment was alive with a spiderweb of dark lines, all radiating from intricate compass roses drawn at strategic points. These were room lines, the sailor's sacred geometry. By aligning a ruler between two compass roses, a navigator could plot a course and hold it day after day, fighting wind and current to reach his destination. The land itself was rendered with an obsessive, almost loving detail, but only its edge. Every cove, every headland, every river mouth along the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts was drawn with a precision that would astonish the creators of the Mappaemundi. The interior of continents, by contrast, was a blank void, sometimes decorated with the flags of coastal cities or sketched in mountains, but ultimately irrelevant. For the sailor, the world was a line, a perilous boundary between the safety of the known shore and the terrifying abyss of the open ocean. These charts were not born in quiet libraries, but in the cacophony of shipyards and harbors, compiled from the lived experience of countless voyages. Each correction, each newly drawn island, was a hard-won piece of intelligence, often paid for in lives. This made Portolan charts incredibly valuable, state secrets that could determine the wealth of nations. They represent a profound shift in imagination. The mapmaker was no longer a priest illustrating divine order or a scholar calculating a grid. He was a craftsman, perhaps even a former sailor himself, whose art was in translating the lived reality of the waves into a guide for those who would follow. This pragmatic focus on the tangible edge, this mastery of the coastline, was the essential training. It gave European sailors the confidence to finally point their prows away from the comforting sight of land, to follow those room lines west across the Atlantic and south along the African coast into the true unknown. The Portolan chart was the key that unlocked the coastline, but the ocean beyond its edge demanded a new kind of courage. And so the Portolan charts gave sailors the lines to follow, but the vast interiors of the continents remained a canvas for the deepest hopes and fears of an age. In the 12th century, a letter began to circulate through the courts of Europe, a document that would capture the imagination for over 500 years. It was from a figure known as Prester John, a fabulously wealthy and powerful Christian king who ruled a kingdom of peace and justice somewhere beyond the lands of Islam. His domain was said to contain the Fountain of Youth, a palace made of crystal, and even the original Garden of Eden itself. This was not just a fable, it was a geopolitical fantasy of immense power. At a time when Christian Europe felt besieged, the idea of a mighty ally waiting in the east, ready to crush Islam in a pincer movement, was intoxicating. The letter, though almost certainly a forgery, was copied and translated endlessly, its details becoming accepted as geographical fact. Map makers, from the creators of the Hereford Mappaemundi to the cartographers of the early age of discovery, began to inscribe his kingdom onto their work with absolute certainty. At first, they placed his realm deep in Asia, perhaps near India. Later, as knowledge of Asia improved and he failed to appear, They simply moved his kingdom to the blank spaces of Africa, a testament to the map's flexibility in serving desire. The location was irrelevant. The need for him to exist was what mattered. This demonstrates a profound truth about these ancient maps. They were not passive records of knowledge. They were active instruments of ambition. The Phantom Kingdom of Prester John directly shaped the goals of explorers. Portuguese navigators probing down the coast of Africa in the 15th century were instructed not just to find a route to the Indies, but to make contact with Prester John, whose Christian kingdom they believed lay just beyond the next river or mountain range. His legend provided a spiritual and political justification for expansion, turning exploration into a holy quest. The cartographers who drew his splendid capital city onto their parchment were, in a very real sense, creating geography from hope. They were drawing the world not as it was, but as their culture desperately needed it to be, proving that the most powerful features on any map are sometimes those drawn with the ink of belief. The phrase "here be dragons" is itself a cartographic myth, a powerful legend about our legends. You will almost never find those exact words inscribed on a genuine medieval map. But you will find the beasts themselves lurking in the swirling sea serpents and dog-faced men that crowd the margins of the world. These were not idle doodles. They were a sophisticated symbolic language for danger. The Norse spoke of the Hafgufa, a monster so vast it was often mistaken for an island, a creature that could swallow ships whole. This was likely a terrifying encoding of the very real peril of sailing too close to a whale, or worse, being lured onto a deadly reef by a deceptive patch of calm water. The legendary kraken, with its grasping tentacles, gave a monstrous face to the sudden, crushing force of a North Atlantic squall, or the disorienting terror of a deep-sea fog. In an age without weather forecasts or depth sounders, the map's monsters served as the most effective warning label possible. They marked the places where the sea itself became the enemy. But these creatures represented more than just physical hazards. They marked a profound psychological frontier. To sail past the last known island was to cross a line not just on a map but in the mind. It was to leave the world of order, of known winds and currents, and enter a realm where the rules of God and nature might no longer apply. By drawing a sea serpent coiling in an empty ocean, the cartographer was giving form to the sailor's deepest fear, the dread of the absolute unknown. The monster was a placeholder for every unimagined peril, a visual shorthand for the simple, terrifying truth: beyond this point, we know nothing. This cartography of fear was a powerful deterrent, a graphic argument against reckless ambition. It reinforced the worldview of the Mappaemundi, where the edges of the earth were the domain of chaos, a fitting abode for creatures that defied the natural order. Yet, paradoxically, these very monsters also charted a map of courage. For every terrifying beast drawn on the edge of a chart, there was eventually a sailor who looked at it, felt the fear, and set sail anyway. The monsters did not just define the limit of the known world, they defined the magnitude of the courage required to cross that line. The empty spaces on a modern map are simply blank, awaiting data. But the empty spaces on an ancient map were alive, filled with the projections of a culture's anxieties. They remind us that every map is a record of human psychology, a document that reveals not only what we knew about the world, but how we felt about the vast, dark spaces beyond the firelight of our understanding. The dragons were never really on the map. They were in the minds of the people who drew it, and more importantly, in the hearts of those who dared to prove them wrong. Yet even the most persistent legends can sometimes cast a real shadow. In the year 1957, a discovery sent shockwaves through the world of cartography, a discovery that seemed to pluck a myth from the edge of the map and place it firmly in the center of history. A bookseller offered a manuscript to the British Museum, a medieval volume bound with a copy of a Tartar relation, a known historical text, but it was the second document, a single folded sheet of parchment, that held the unbelievable secret. When unfolded, it revealed a world map unlike any other. It showed Europe, Africa, and Asia with the familiar contours of a 15th century Portolan chart. But in the distant northwest Atlantic, far beyond Greenland, the map depicted a large, irregular island labeled in Latin as Vinland. According to the inscription, it had been discovered by Leif Erikson and his crew around the year 1000. If this map was genuine, it was not merely an artifact, it was a bomb. It suggested that knowledge of the American continent had not only reached Europe decades before Christopher Columbus set sail, but that this knowledge had been formally recorded by a European cartographer, fundamentally rewriting the story of the discovery of the New World. The initial excitement was electric. The map's style, its script, even the wormholes in the parchment that matched the accompanying manuscript, all pointed to a mid-15th century origin. Here was tangible proof that the Norse sagas, long considered semi-legendary tales of Viking voyages to a place they called Vinland, were not just stories. They were history, and that history had been mapped. The implications were staggering. It meant that the world's edge, as imagined by European scholars, had been pushed back generations earlier than anyone had believed. The traditional timeline of exploration, a cornerstone of historical narrative, was suddenly under threat, but almost immediately the whispers of doubt began. The very thing that made the map so explosive, its precocious detail, also made it suspect. The ink became the central battlefield. Medieval ink was typically iron gall, made from oak galls and iron sulfate, which corrodes the parchment over centuries, leaving the writing etched into the page. The ink on the Vinland map, however, seemed to sit on top of the parchment. Chemical analysis later revealed the presence of anatase, a very specific and rare form of titanium dioxide. Proponents argued this could be a natural contaminant, perhaps from a particular sand used to dry the ink. Skeptics countered that anatase of this purity was a 20th century industrial product, a definitive marker of a modern forgery. The debate grew fiercely technical, a war waged in scientific journals with spectrometers and electron microscopes. Each new analysis seemed to swing the pendulum. One study would declare the ink medieval, the next would point to modern chemicals. The parchment itself was dated by carbon-14 testing to around the 1430s or 1440s, which fit the proposed timeline perfectly. But this only deepened the mystery. Was it a brilliant modern forgery on genuinely old parchment, or was the anomalous ink simply a quirk of its unique creation? The true enigma of the Vinland map is not just a question of chemistry, it is a question of human motive. If it is a forgery, it is a work of diabolical genius, created with a profound understanding of medieval history and cartography, designed not for a quick profit but to deliberately reshape our understanding of the past. The forger would have needed to acquire ancient parchment, master a forgotten script, and then plant this historical landmine, waiting for it to be discovered and detonate the accepted narrative. Yet, if it is genuine, it tells a perhaps sadder story, one of knowledge lost. It suggests that the Norse discovery of America was not a complete secret, that this geographic intelligence did filter back to Europe, only to be ignored, forgotten, or filed away as an irrelevant curiosity. The map would then be a ghost, a whisper of a path not taken, a premature vision of the world's true shape that simply faded away because the world was not yet ready to believe it. This single, fragile piece of parchment forces us to confront the fragility of history itself. It asks whether our timeline of discovery is a solid chain of events, or merely the version that managed to survive, while other, truer maps were lost to time, their dragons replaced by an even more terrifying creature, the ghost of what might have been. While the Vinland map remains an enigma, a single undisputed masterpiece from Venice captures the very moment the medieval world began to crack. Housed in a monastery on the small island of Murano, Fra Mauro, a Camaldolese monk, was not an explorer. He was a master synthesizer, a cartographic conductor orchestrating a chorus of voices from across the known world. Around 1450, he produced a massive circular map, nearly 2 meters across, that is less a drawing and more a visual encyclopedia of 15th century geography. Its sheer density of text and detail is staggering, a testament to a mind determined to compile every available scrap of knowledge. Fra Mauro did not venture beyond his studio, but the world came to him. He explicitly states that he relied not on the authority of Ptolemy, but on what he called the eyewitness accounts of trustworthy people. His sources were merchants from the Silk Road, Arab geographers whose works were translated in Venetian trading posts, and most critically, the latest reports from Portuguese sailors who were, at that very moment, edging their way down the coast of West Africa. This map is therefore a living document, a snapshot of a planet being rediscovered in real time. The most revolutionary feature is its treatment of Africa. For over 1,000 years, Ptolemy's authority had insisted Africa was landlocked, connected to a vast southern continent that enclosed the Indian Ocean. Fra Mauro, armed with Portuguese charts and Arab knowledge, boldly rejected this. He drew Africa as an independent continent surrounded by sea, with its southern tip clearly defined. He even included a note suggesting it had been circumnavigated by an ancient voyage, a direct challenge to the classical model. This was not just a correction, it was an act of intellectual emancipation. The map is a beautiful contradiction, a bridge between two eras. It still contains the mythical islands of medieval legend, like the island of Satanas, the island of devils, placed cautiously in the Atlantic. Yet right beside these legends, you find remarkably accurate depictions of places like India and China, based on the accounts of travelers like Marco Polo and Niccolo da Conti. The map's edges are a battleground where old myths are slowly retreating before an advancing front of empirical fact. Fra Mauro was standing at the precipice, looking back at a world defined by ancient texts and forward to one defined by observation. His map is the last great masterpiece of the pre-colonial world, and the first to hint at the global connectedness that was about to explode. It proves that the greatest discoveries often happen not on the deck of a ship, but in the quiet mind of a scholar who dares to listen to the whispers of the world and redraw the lines. Fra Mauro's meticulous hand-crafted world was a singular masterpiece, but a new technology was about to make such individuality obsolete. The invention of the printing press did not just reproduce books, it replicated reality itself. For the first time in history, a single map could be printed in hundreds of identical copies, each one a perfect twin of the original. Cartography was ripped from the exclusive scriptoriums of monks and the guarded workshops of chart makers and placed into the bustling marketplace of ideas. This was a revolution as profound as any voyage of discovery. A scholar in Lisbon, a merchant in Antwerp, and a ship's captain in Bristol could now all study the exact same depiction of the world's edge. Knowledge was no longer a fragile, unique artifact, it was a commodity. This democratization of geography created an unprecedented hunger for new maps, fueling a competitive industry centered in printing hubs like Nuremberg, Venice, and Antwerp. It was in the German workshop of Martin Waldseemüller that this new power was most dramatically displayed. In 1507, he and his partner produced a colossal world map, along with a cosmography book that made a bold cartographic declaration. In the vast Western Ocean, where most maps showed only scattered mythical islands, Waldseemüller drew a long, slender continent separated from Asia by a wide sea. And he gave it a name, America, in honor of the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose published letters argued that these new lands were a separate continent, a new world. With a pull of a lever on a printing press, a name was born and a concept was cemented into the European imagination. Yet this power to standardize came with a dark twin, the power to immortalize error. A single mistake in a master engraving, a speculative coastline drawn from a sailor's exaggerated tale, would now be duplicated with unforgiving consistency. The mythical Sea of the West, a giant inland sea that persisted on maps of North America for decades, was one such phantom, copied from one printed atlas to the next long after explorers had proven it did not exist. The press did not just spread knowledge, it fossilized conjecture, granting a false authority to the best guesses and outright fictions of the day. The world's edges, as imagined by a handful of influential printers, became the accepted truth for thousands, shaping the ambitions of explorers and the policies of kings. The printed map created a consensus reality, for better or worse, making the imagined world more solid, more persistent, and more difficult to challenge than ever before. The printed map's authority, however, was about to be tested by the creak of timber and the billowing of canvas. The late 15th century did not simply add new details to the old charts, it shattered them. One by one, the great mythical barriers that had guarded the world's edges for a millennium were breached, not by scholars in libraries, but by sailors on the open ocean. In 1488, the Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias, fighting fierce winds and currents, was blown around the southernmost tip of Africa. He called it the Cape of Storms, but his king, seeing the gateway to the Indies, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. With that single voyage, Ptolemy's ancient era of a landlocked Indian Ocean was definitively disproved. The southern edge of the world was not a wall of land, but an open door. Just a few years later, a Genoese captain acting for the Spanish crown sailed west across the Atlantic, not to find the edge, but to reach the east. Christopher Columbus' journey was guided by a critical miscalculation, a belief in a shrunken globe where Asia lay just a few weeks' sail away. When he made landfall, he was certain he had reached the outer islands of the Indies. He had not. He had stumbled upon a continent entirely unknown to the European world, a monumental discovery born from a colossal error. The maps now had to accommodate a landmass that simply did not exist in any classical text, a problem that would take decades to fully resolve. Then came the final, definitive proof, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, culminating in the first circumnavigation of the globe by Juan Sebastián Elcano after Magellan's death, provided irrefutable evidence. The Earth was not only spherical, it was circumnavigable, a single, interconnected world of oceans and lands. The dragons had not just been pushed back, their entire domain had been mapped out of existence. This explosion of new knowledge created a frantic demand for maps that could capture the new reality. The Cantino Planisphere, smuggled out of Portugal in 1502, is a perfect snapshot of this frantic, secretive race. It shows the known world with a startling new addition, the bulging coastline of Brazil, recently claimed by Portugal. The map is a political weapon, a declaration of territorial claims drawn with pen and ink. For the first time, you can see the entire globe taking shape, not as a philosophical concept, but as a geopolitical chessboard. The cartographer's imagination was forced into a rapid, dramatic contraction. The vast, speculative southern continent shrinks. The open sea between Europe and Asia expands. The world was becoming a known quantity, its edges hardening from the soft focus of myth into the sharp, measurable lines of a frontier. This was a thrilling but also terrifying disruption. The old maps had offered a comforting, ordered cosmos. the new maps revealed a planet of staggering scale and brutal competition, a home that was suddenly and irrevocably much larger and more complex than anyone had ever dreamed. The Zeno map arrived in Venice like a ghost from the past, a century after the voyages it claimed to record. Published in 1558 by a descendant named Niccolo Zeno, the small book and its accompanying map told an astonishing story. It described how two brothers, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, had sailed into the North Atlantic in the 1300s, decades before Columbus, serving a powerful lord named Zichmni. Their adventures, as narrated by their descendant, described lands far to the west that sounded suspiciously like North America. One was called Estathiland, a place with great forests and sophisticated inhabitants who owned books in a Latin alphabet. Another was Drogeo, a vast territory to the south where the people were cannibals, saved from sacrifice only by the intervention of their captors. The map itself was a wonder of detail, showing a sprawling Greenland, a phantom island called Friesland lying southeast of it, and these mysterious western lands. For European geographers, it was a bombshell. If true, it meant Venetian explorers had not only reached America first, but had created a remarkably accurate chart of the North Atlantic. The map was eagerly copied by cartographers like Mercator and Ortelius, and Friesland became a fixture on maps for over 100 years, a solid, believable landmass that explorers actively searched for. The problem is, almost every detail of this story is shrouded in doubt. The original letters and charts that Niccolo the Descendant claimed to have found were, conveniently, destroyed by his own admission. He published only his version of the story, a reconstruction from tattered fragments. This immediately raises the question, was he piecing together a lost family history? Or was he constructing a brilliant forgery to claim Venetian glory in the age of discovery? The evidence is a tangled web. The map gets some things startlingly right. Its depiction of Greenland's southern coastline is far more accurate than any other European map of the era, suggesting the compiler had access to genuine Norse sailing directions or charts that are now lost. This kernel of truth is what gives the map its enduring power, but then it invents entire geographies. Friesland, which appears as a large island between Iceland and the British Isles, simply does not exist. Scholars now believe Friesland is a cartographic phantom, a mishmash of misidentified parts of Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and perhaps even a distorted view of the Shetland Islands, all blended together with pure invention. The name Estathiland sounds intriguingly like the Norse word for eastern settlement in Greenland, but placed far to the west. It is a classic case of taking real, whispered knowledge and extrapolating it into a fictional geography. The most plausible explanation is that the younger Niccolo Zeno, burning with familial and civic pride, created a masterpiece of historical fiction. He likely had access to Norse sailing lore passed down through fishermen and traders in the North Sea. He would have known the Viking sagas that spoke of Vinland. Combining these fragments with the actual, state-of-the-art Portuguese and Spanish maps of his own time, he wove a plausible and compelling narrative. He gave his ancestors a starring role in the greatest story of the age, the discovery of the New World. The Zeno map is not merely a forgery, it is a map of desire. It represents the powerful urge to fill the blank spaces on the chart not just with land, but with legacy. It shows how easily the lines between discovery, rumor, and outright fabrication could blur in an age when a map could make a family's reputation and a nation's claim. The phantom islands it created were so persuasive because they were what everyone expected to find, remnants of a lost world just over the horizon. They persisted on maps until better navigators with more precise instruments finally sailed through the empty waters where Friesland was supposed to be. proving that the most persistent monsters on a map are not dragons, but the islands we wish were there. This phantom continent began not with a ship's sighting, but with a philosopher's sense of order. Ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle reasoned that the world, a sphere, must possess a certain symmetry to remain stable. They observed that most known land was clustered in the northern hemisphere. To balance this planetary weight, they postulated a great landmass in the south, a necessary counterweight to prevent the world from tipping over. This was not a geographic observation, but a philosophical requirement, an idea so elegant it became an article of faith for cartographers. When Ptolemy compiled his masterwork, he gave this theory the full authority of science, drawing Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, as a vast continent enclosing the Indian Ocean, connecting to Africa and Asia. For over 1,000 years, this was not a speculation, it was a fact inscribed on the very framework of the world. The logic was unassailable, the Earth demanded balance, and so the mapmakers provided it. This continent of the mind grew richer with every passing century. It was a land of immense potential wealth, a place where all the gold and spices that overflowed from travelers' tales about the East might find their true, abundant source. Some even imagined it as the original home of the human race, an untouched paradise waiting to be rediscovered. The mapmakers, from the great Abraham Ortelius to Gerardus Mercator, did not draw a blank space. They drew a detailed coastline with mountains, rivers, and gulfs, a fully formed world born entirely from theory. They were not being dishonest, they were fulfilling their highest duty, which was to present a complete and orderly picture of God's creation. The strength of this belief sent real ships on real, perilous voyages. When the Spanish explorer Pedro Fernández de Quiros landed on what we now know is the island of Vanuatu in 1606, he was utterly convinced he had found the northern shore of the great southern continent. He named it Australia del Espiritu Santo, claiming this entire phantom land for Spain and the Church in a grand ceremony. He saw not a small volcanic island, but the beachhead of a civilization shaping discovery. For 2 more centuries, the search continued, each voyage chipping away at the fantasy. The Dutch encounter with the western coast of what they called New Holland, our Australia, was a disappointment. It was arid and seemed to offer no passage to a richer interior continent. They had found a large island, but not the legendary landmass. The final, definitive blow was delivered by the ultimate cartographer of the seas, Captain James Cook. His first voyage, culminating in his charting of New Zealand, proved it was not the tip of a giant continent but a pair of islands. His second voyage, between 1772 and 1775, was a systematic assassination of the myth. He sailed deep into the Antarctic Circle, further south than any European had ever ventured, through fields of pack ice and brutal cold. He circumnavigated the globe at a high southern latitude, proving conclusively that if a great habitable continent existed, it could only be a frozen, inaccessible land locked behind a prison of ice. The beautiful, balanced world of the philosophers simply did not exist. The true legacy of Terra Australis Incognita is not a landmass, but a lesson in the power of an idea. It shows how a concept, once it satisfies a deep human craving for order and symmetry, can persist for millennia, defying all evidence to the contrary. The mapmakers were not just drawing coastlines, they were drawing a vision of a perfect, balanced cosmos, a world that made sense. The empty ocean that Cook revealed was, in its own way, more disorienting than any sea monster. It was a blankness that offered no easy answers, a reminder that the world is under no obligation to conform to our sense of what is fair, logical, or beautiful. Gerardus Mercator's great ambition was not to depict the world as it truly was, but to make it navigable. His famous map of 1569, titled with the humble phrase, "For the use of navigators," solved a problem that had plagued sailors for centuries. How do you draw a spherical planet on a flat sheet of paper so that a straight line means something real out on the open ocean? The Portolan charts had used a web of room lines for coastal navigation, but these became useless over vast distances on a curved Earth. A straight compass course, if drawn on most flat maps, would force a ship into a slow, spiraling curve. Mercator's brilliant mathematical insight was to stretch the globe like a piece of soft taffy. He took the lines of latitude and spaced them further and further apart as they moved away from the equator toward the poles. This gradual stretching had a miraculous effect. It forced all the room lines, those vital straight-line courses, to appear as straight lines on the map. A navigator could now draw a single line from Lisbon to the Caribbean and know that by holding a constant compass bearing, he would actually arrive. It was a tool of immense practical power, a master key that unlocked the great ocean highways. But this navigational miracle came at a profound cost, a visual distortion so embedded in the system that we often fail to see it. By stretching the high latitudes to keep the angles true, Mercator massively exaggerated the size of everything near the poles. On his map, Greenland appears larger than the entire continent of Africa. In reality, Africa is 14 times larger than Greenland. Scandinavia looks comparable to India, which is actually 3 times its size. This was not an error. It was the unavoidable consequence of the projection's mathematical logic. For centuries, this did not matter much. The map was a specialist tool for sailors who understood its purpose. The problem began when this navigational chart escaped the captain's cabin and found its way onto the walls of classrooms and atlases across the Western world. It ceased to be seen as a specialized instrument and was mistaken for an accurate portrait of the world. The distortion became an unconscious lesson in geography, subtly teaching generations that Europe and North America were far more significant, far larger on the global stage than the tropical lands of the global South. The map, designed to tame the edges of the sea for navigation, ended up reshaping our mental image of the entire planet, creating a powerful and persistent bias that equated size with importance. Mercator had given the world a perfect tool for one job, and in doing so, he accidentally defined the edges of our imagination for centuries. Mercator's projection gave sailors the lines to sail by, but the true power of those lines was not in their geometry, it was in their secrecy. A map in the wrong hands could mean the difference between an empire's rise and its ruin. In the war rooms of Lisbon and the counting houses of Seville, maps were treated with the same sensitivity as military plans because they were. This was the cartographic arms race, a shadow war where the greatest weapon was a well-drawn coastline. At the heart of this struggle was the Spanish Padrón Real, the royal pattern. This was not a single map, but a constantly updated master chart, the official repository of all geographical intelligence flowing into the Casa de Contratación in Seville from every Spanish ship returning from the New World. Its keepers were among the most important officials in the empire, tasked with meticulously incorporating each new discovery, each corrected bay, each dangerous reef reported by captains. To consult the Padrón Real was to see the expanding Spanish Empire in its most current form. Access was fiercely restricted, and copying it was a crime punishable by death. The Spanish aim was total control, to monopolize the routes to the unimaginable wealth of the Americas. Yet the very existence of such a prize made it a target. Rival nations deployed every tool of espionage to steal its secrets. The most famous act of cartographic theft was orchestrated by the Italian diplomat and spy, Alberto Cantino. In 1502, he successfully bribed a Portuguese chartmaker to create a stunningly detailed copy of the Royal Portuguese map. the equivalent of the Padron Real. The resulting Cantino Planisphere was then smuggled out of Lisbon and delivered to his patron, the Duke of Ferrara. This single act of theft gave Italy, and soon all of Europe, its first clear view of the discoveries that Portugal and Spain were trying so desperately to hide. The map revealed the bulging coast of Brazil and the detailed route around Africa into the Indian Ocean, intelligence that was priceless, but theft was only one tactic. Mapmakers also became masters of deception, weaving fiction directly into their charts to confound their rivals. It was common practice to insert phantom islands or subtly distort a coastline. A captain relying on a stolen or copied map might waste precious weeks searching for an island that never existed, or sail his ship onto a reef because the chart placed it a few fatal miles out of position. These paper islands were the cartographic equivalent of a poisoned well. One such phantom, Sandy Island, appeared on maps in the Coral Sea near New Caledonia for over a century, noted as a potential hazard. It was only definitively erased from charts in 2012, when a scientific survey ship sailed directly over its reported location and found only open ocean 2,000 feet deep. This deliberate pollution of geographic truth meant that even as the world's edges were being defined, they were simultaneously being obscured by a fog of lies. The map was no longer just a record of knowledge or a tool for navigation. It was an active participant in the struggle for global dominance, its blank spaces and inked lines serving as a silent, treacherous battlefield. The vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean became the final frontier for these cartographic phantoms. Long after the Atlantic's dragons had been banished by charts, the Pacific remained a realm of whispers and mirages. Its sheer scale defied comprehension, a blue desert so immense that a ship could sail for months without sighting land, where a single navigational error could multiply into 1,000 miles of fiction. Here, islands appeared on the most respected maps for generations, only to vanish when another ship passed through the same empty coordinates. Rica de Oro and Rica de Plata, the islands of gold and silver, were two such persistent phantoms. They first appeared on Spanish charts in the 16th century, promising untold wealth to the east of Japan. For over 200 years, expeditions were launched to find them, driven by the same lust for treasure that fueled the conquest of the Americas. Sailors reported seeing their peaks on the horizon, their outlines clear against the setting sun, but no ship ever managed to land because the islands were not there. They were likely the result of a perfect storm of navigational misfortune, a misreading of currents combined with a common maritime illusion known as a superior mirage. In certain atmospheric conditions, a layer of warm air can act like a lens, bending light to make distant objects, or even the clouds above them, appear as solid land hovering just above the horizon. A weary lookout, desperate for the sight of shore after weeks at sea, would see a mountain where there was only sky. His report would be logged, the coordinates noted, and a new phantom would be born. The case of Pepys Island is even more telling. In 1683, the English explorer William Ambrose Cowley confidently charted an island off the coast of South America, naming it after the Secretary of the Admiralty, Samuel Pepys. He described it in detail, a place with a fine harbor and rolling hills. For decades, it was a fixture on British maps, but when other ships went to look, they found nothing. The most likely explanation is that Cowley had simply misidentified one of the Falkland Islands, his reckoning thrown off by weeks of turbulent weather. His honest error, given the authority of his printed account, created a ghost that lingered on charts for nearly a century. The erasure of these islands was a slow, deliberate process. It required not a single voyage of discovery, but many voyages of disproof. A captain would sail to the recorded latitude and longitude, spend days crisscrossing the empty sea, and return to report the absence of land. But cartographers were cautious. Who was to say this captain had not simply missed it? Perhaps the original coordinates were slightly off. The phantom would be marked with a question mark, or labeled as reported but unverified. It often took multiple expeditions from different nations, all failing to find the same island before it was finally scrubbed from the map. This painstaking work was the final chapter in the age of speculative cartography. Each vanished island represented a small victory for empirical observation over rumor and illusion. They were the last echoes of a time when the map was a living document, a mixture of hard-won fact and hopeful fiction, a record not just of the world as it was, but of the human desire to find something, anything, in the boundless unknown. James Cook's voyages were a surgical strike against the last great unknowns. He sailed not for treasure or empire alone, but with a scientist's mandate to measure, to observe, to verify. His 3 expeditions between 1768 and 1779 were equipped with the ultimate weapon against cartographic ghosts, the marine chronometer. This ingenious clock, known as the K1, built by John Harrison, could keep accurate time at sea, allowing Cook's navigators to calculate their longitude with a precision that was previously unimaginable. For the first time, a ship could place itself, and any island it discovered, on the globe with absolute certainty. Cook's logs are not filled with tales of monsters or golden cities. They are meticulous records of depth soundings, wind directions, and coastal profiles. He approached the map not as an artist filling in blank spaces with legend, but as a surveyor whose only ink was the indelible line of fact. His first voyage shattered the dream of a great southern continent. After meticulously charting the complete coastline of New Zealand and proving it was 2 islands, not a peninsula of some larger landmass, he then sailed west until he struck the eastern shore of Australia. He mapped its fertile eastern coast with such painstaking detail that his charts were used for over a century. But it was his second voyage that delivered the final blow to Terra Australis. He plunged deep into the Antarctic Circle, further south than any ship had ever ventured, his vessels, the Resolution and Adventure, battling monstrous icebergs and freezing fog. He circumnavigated the globe at a high southern latitude, demonstrating conclusively that any land there was locked in an impassable fortress of ice. The balanced, habitable continent of the philosophers simply was not there. The map had to be redrawn not by adding new lands, but by erasing a 1,000-year-old fantasy. His third and final voyage sought another phantom, the Northwest Passage. For centuries, European mapmakers had drawn a hopeful channel across the top of North America, a shortcut to the riches of Asia. Cook, approaching from the Pacific side, mapped the Alaskan coast with relentless precision, probing every inlet and sound. But every channel he entered ended in a wall of ice or a dead end of land. He proved that if a passage existed, it was utterly impassable for the ships of his day. Cook's legacy was a paradox. He brought a new era of geographical certainty, replacing the dragons and phantom islands with crisp, accurate coastline. Yet, in a way, he also closed a chapter of human wonder. His maps left no room for Prester John's kingdom or the islands of gold. The world's edges were now defined by the hard, unyielding data of latitude and longitude. The ocean was no longer a canvas for our deepest fears and desires, but a measured space, known and predictable. The great age of imagining what lay beyond the firelight was over. The map was finally and irrevocably real. In a dusty Istanbul library in 1929, a fragment of painted parchment emerged that would ignite one of cartography's most enduring firestorms. It was a world map drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. Only a portion survived, showing the Atlantic Ocean with the coastlines of Europe, Africa, and a tantalizing landmass to the west. But it is the southern edge of this western land that has fueled decades of speculation. Some researchers point to a strangely shaped coastline and claim, against all conventional history, that it accurately depicts Queen Maud Land in Antarctica, not as it appears today, but as it would look without its mile-thick ice cap, a geography unknown to modern science until the mid-20th century. The implication is staggering that a pre-modern civilization with advanced knowledge mapped the Antarctic continent thousands of years before anyone else. Piri Reis himself complicated the mystery with his own notes. He openly stated that his work was a compilation, synthesizing about 20 source maps, including several from the time of Christopher Columbus and, most intriguingly, ancient maps dating back to the Library of Alexandria. This admission seems to open a door to a lost epoch of exploration. Yet scholars who have studied the map in detail offer a more grounded, though no less fascinating, explanation. They argue that the controversial coastline aligns remarkably well with the eastern coast of South America, particularly when you account for the common distortions of early 16th century cartography. The area identified as an ice-free Antarctica could simply be a stretched and misshapen representation of the Argentine coast, with the prominent protrusions mirroring features like the Golfo de San Matías. The theory gains strength when you consider that Piri Reis's sources likely included Portuguese charts that were carefully guarded state secrets, maps that would have contained the very latest, albeit imperfect, knowledge of the New World. The true lesson of the Piri Reis map may not be about ancient astronauts or lost civilizations, but about the powerful allure of a blank space on a chart. We see in its lines what we want to see, the desire for a forgotten golden age, for knowledge that transcends time, can lead us to project incredible accuracy onto an artifact that is, more probably, a remarkable but human product of its time, a patchwork of the best available sources, riddled with the same guesses and errors as every other map from the dawn of global exploration. It stands as a perfect symbol for our journey, a document that captures the moment the old world's edges were being redrawn, not from fantasy, but from the slow, painful, and often misinterpreted reports flowing back from over the horizon. A sea serpent coils not just to frighten sailors, but to beautify the page. These maps were never intended to be sterile diagrams. They were rich tapestries woven with threads of gold leaf and colored ink, where every flourish served a purpose. The cityscapes drawn along a coastline were not attempts at scale, but declarations of power and piety. A tiny drawing of a king seated on a throne beside a river told the viewer who ruled that land, a piece of political intelligence as vital as the river's course itself. The mapmaker was an artist, an illustrator, and a storyteller all at once. Consider the wind faces, those cherubic figures puffing their cheeks from the corners of a Renaissance chart. To a modern eye, they seem purely decorative, but for a sailor, they were a functional guide. Each face represented a specific wind, its character and direction. A gentle, benevolent face blowing from the west might promise fair weather for a journey, while a scowling, tempestuous face from the northeast served as a stark warning of treacherous gales. This was a sophisticated visual language for meteorology, a qualitative understanding of the world's forces that numbers on a grid could never capture. Even the most fantastical animals served as a kind of ecological report. A drawing of an elephant in the heart of Africa or a camel on the edge of Asia was not necessarily a claim that such a beast was precisely there. It was a symbolic shorthand telling the map's reader that this region was the source of such wonders, that it held resources and creatures beyond the imagination of someone in Europe. These illustrations transformed the map into a condensed encyclopedia, offering a sensory impression of distant lands. They answered the question of what a place was like, not just where it was. This artistic layer made the abstract tangible. A ruler in Lisbon, unrolling a new world map, could not only trace the route his ships would take, but could also see miniature paintings of the strange peoples they might encounter, the architecture of their cities, the animals that roamed their forests. The map became a portal, engaging the viewer's curiosity, fear, and ambition simultaneously. It was a work of propaganda, too, by depicting a rival kingdom's lands with monstrous creatures or a smaller, less detailed city. A cartographer could subtly diminish its importance. Every artistic choice, from the vibrancy of a color to the grandeur of a depicted castle, was a comment on the world it represented. The art did not obscure the geography, it completed it, giving the map a soul and a voice that spoke directly to the heart of the explorer, the merchant, and the dreamer. That line drawn in ink on a Portolan chart traced the boundary between the known shore and the abyss. But for the civilizations that first conceived of maps, the most critical frontiers were not made of water. They were thresholds of the soul. The ancient cartographer's pen was just as likely to chart the geography of the afterlife as it was to outline a coastline. Deep within an Egyptian tomb, a map was painted on the inside lid of a coffin, not to guide the living, but to navigate the dead through the perilous landscapes of the underworld. This was the Book of the Two Ways, a vivid flowchart of the journey to the afterlife. It presents the deceased with a choice, two winding paths, one by land and one by water, each filled with divine gatekeepers, lakes of fire, and demonic entities that must be overcome. This was not a symbolic drawing, it was a practical guide, a spiritual GPS intended to ensure the soul reached the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. Every twist and turn, every deity and demon was plotted with the same care a sailor would use to mark a safe harbor. The edge it sought to cross was the ultimate one, the line between life and death. Similarly, Babylonian priests looked upward, not outward, to draw their most important charts. They meticulously mapped the night sky, but they were not tracking stars as simple points of light. They were plotting the nightly journey of the gods. Each constellation was a divine being, and its movement across the heavens was a story of cosmic order and celestial authority. These star maps were used for divination, to understand the will of the gods and predict the fate of kingdoms. The edge they were concerned with was the boundary between earth and heaven, the line where human affairs met divine intention. This reveals a profound truth about the origins of cartography. The drive to map the world's physical edges, to push back the blank spaces on the globe, was merely one expression of a much deeper, universal human impulse. It was part of a grand project to impose order on the entire cosmos, to chart every conceivable realm, from the depths of the underworld to the highest paths of the stars. A map was the ultimate tool for making the incomprehensible manageable, for turning the chaos of existence into a landscape that could be navigated, understood, and ultimately conquered by knowledge. The courage it took to draw a line into an unknown ocean was the very same courage it took to diagram the journey of the soul. Both acts were declarations that even the greatest mysteries could be captured, measured, and brought within the comforting bounds of a map. The fire that consumed the Library of Alexandria was a catastrophe measured not in burning scrolls, but in vanishing worlds. Within its vast halls, the most complete geographical archive ever assembled was reduced to ashes. The original hand-drawn world map of Eratosthenes, with its elegant grid calculating the planet's vast girth, was lost forever. Ptolemy's own master charts, likely far more detailed than the coordinate lists that survived him, disappeared. Most tragically, we lost the raw materials of exploration, the detailed logs of Phoenician sailors who may have circumnavigated Africa, and the accounts of Greek captains who ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the foggy Atlantic. This was not a single library burning. It was the deletion of 1,000 voices who had already begun to describe the true shape of the earth. The intellectual setback was profound. For the medieval scholars who came later, geography became a game of whispers. They were left with fragments, copies of copies, and summaries that were often riddled with errors. They had to reconstruct the grandeur of classical geography from second-hand accounts, like trying to reassemble a shattered mosaic with only half the tiles. The confident, measured world of the Greeks was replaced by a world of speculation and myth. The Mappaemundi, with its theological certainty, flourished in this vacuum of hard data. The haunting question is, how much farther would cartography have progressed if that library had stood? Would the Norse discovery of Vinland have remained a curious footnote, or would it have been integrated into a continuous tradition of exploration, sparking a transatlantic exchange centuries earlier? The loss of Alexandria is the great silence in the story of mapmaking, a reminder that the path of knowledge is not a straight line of progress. It is a fragile thread, easily broken, and what we call the Age of Discovery was in many ways a desperate, centuries-long attempt to recover what had already been known and then forgotten in the flames. The final phantom islands have been erased from our screens, replaced by the unblinking eye of satellites. We carry in our pockets a map of the entire world, a reality that would have been unimaginable to any of the cartographers we have discussed. With a swipe of a finger, we can zoom from a global view to the roof of our own house, seeing our planet with a precision that would have made Mercator weep with awe. The geographical unknown, the great white spaces that once held dragons and golden cities, has been filled with data. Every mountain has been measured, every desert scanned, every coastline digitized. It seems the ancient quest is over, the map is complete, but has the cartographer's imagination truly become obsolete, or has it simply found new edges to explore? The blank spaces have not vanished, they have migrated. They now exist in the crushing, lightless depths of the ocean floor, where we have better maps of the surface of Mars than of our own seabed. Here, in the abyssal plains and hydrothermal vents, lie ecosystems and topographies still being discovered, a frontier as vast and mysterious as any Terra Incognita. The impulse to chart the unknown has turned inward toward the ultimate uncharted territory, the human brain. Projects like the Human Connectome Project are the new Mappaemundi, attempting to trace the neural pathways and synaptic connections that form the landscape of consciousness itself. This is a map not of physical space, but of thought and identity, a cartography of the self. And perhaps the most profound new frontier is the virtual one, the sprawling, invisible architecture of data space. Every click, every purchase, every social connection creates a digital topography that is constantly being mapped and analyzed by algorithms. These maps of our behavior, our desires, and our networks are the new Portolan charts, guiding the flow of capital and influence through a world that is entirely man-made. The cartographer's essential task has not changed. We are still taking that which is vast, complex, and unseen, and rendering it into a form we can understand and navigate. The spirit of the medieval monk, drawing the soul's journey, lives on in the scientist mapping a neural network. The ambition of Piri Reis, compiling scattered sources into a unified vision, is echoed in the data analyst synthesizing billions of data points. We have not lost the sense of wonder, we have simply redirected it. The dragons are gone from the edges of the map, but they have been replaced by the mysteries of dark matter, the riddles of artificial intelligence, and the unexplored potential of our own biology. The unknown has not been conquered, it has been redefined, and the human urge to draw a line into its depths is as strong as ever. That void left by our complete maps is not empty, it echoes with whispers of what might have been. The very certainty of our satellite imagery has fueled a counter-desire, a deep and abiding hunger for lost worlds and forgotten knowledge. This is why theories about the Piri Reis map or the lost continent of Atlantis hold such power over us. They are not merely historical curiosities, they are rebellions against a world that feels too thoroughly known. In an age where every square inch of the planet has been photographed from space, the idea that a magnificent civilization like Atlantis could have vanished without a trace, leaving only a cryptic reference in Plato's dialogues, is profoundly appealing. It reintroduces a fundamental mystery into a landscape that has been stripped of its secrets. The same impulse drives the endless search for El Dorado, the city of gold. Long after explorers proved no such place existed in the South American jungles, the legend persists, transformed from a physical location into a metaphor for an unattainable dream. These stories captivate us because they speak to a romance of the unexplored that is hardwired into our psyche. For millennia, the edge of the map was a physical frontier, a line you could theoretically sail toward. Today, that edge has become internal. It exists in the tantalizing gaps of our historical record, in the unexplained anomalies that challenge our neat timelines. It lives in the realm of speculative fiction, where we imagine futures on other planets or uncover ancient technologies that rewrite history. This enduring fascination proves that the cartographer's most lasting creation was not any single chart, but the sense of wonder they ignited. By daring to draw the unknown, they taught us that the world is always larger than our current understanding of it. The quest for knowledge did not end when the last coastline was drawn, it simply changed its destination. We now map the human genome, the depths of the ocean, and the vastness of digital space, each a new Terra Incognita filled with its own potential for discovery and myth. The dragons may be gone from the sea, but they have found a new home in the uncharted territories of our own imagination, ensuring that the mapmaker's journey will never truly be over. Our journey from the symbolic discs of Babylon to the pixel-perfect globes of today reveals that mapping the world has always been an act of profound imagination. The lost mapmakers of antiquity were not merely recording what they saw, they were interpreting their universe, blending observation with myth, science with faith. The dragons on the edges of their maps were as real to them as the GPS coordinates are to us, symbols of the limits of their knowledge and the courage required to push beyond them. The story of cartography is the story of humanity slowly, painstakingly, replacing fear with understanding. As we continue to chart new frontiers, from the ocean depths to the digital realm, we carry forward the same spirit of inquiry that led those first cartographers to inscribe, "Here be wonders." Share in the comments which ancient map or mystery captivates you the most.